So I started my career in the film industry in Hollywood and actually in China and Hong Kong. And the brief thing I'll talk about my experience in China, this was in the 1980s when China was just opening up under Deng Xiaoping, and they were going from very polemic films, boy meets tractor, boy loses tractor, boy gets tractor, very kind of serious, hit you over the head, to really kind of provocative cultural pieces that were more allegorical. And it was one of the things that helped transform that country, and still is. And it really hit home the power of popular media in a culture. In the early 1990s, Activision, the big commercial game company, had gone through bankruptcy, and some young entrepreneurs bought it for a couple $100,000, moved it from Silicon Valley to Hollywood. The CD-ROM was coming out. They had this idea that there was going to be, instead of 1 or 2 programmers in a room, you would have artists and writers and animators. It was fairly prescient. They hired me from the film side, and really wanted to explore how do we make this medium richer. They weren't really looking for social impact, but really on a commercial level, how do we make this medium stay true to what games are about, but bring some of the rich production values of film? And so I thought it'd be fun to do for a few months. I mean, I was happily doing my film career, but it sounded interesting. And I mean, this is pretty much the reaction I got from all my film friends. Like, are you crazy? Video games? And I mean, this was almost everybody else. At that point in the early 90s, games were vilified by almost everybody. The left, the right, parents, teachers, folks in Hollywood at best thought it was like lunchboxes that you would license to. But what I found when I was there, all the way up to 2000, I ended up going from their head of creative affairs to the head of production to running their studios in LA, hundreds of games. Was that this was an unbelievably rich, complex, textured medium. I could talk about lots of games and lots of stories, but I'll just mention one, the one in the middle top, Spycraft. This was a really interesting game. It wasn't one of our most successful ones, but it's one that I often think back to. We actually got the former head of the CIA and the former head of the KGB, the actual guys, to work with us on this game, William Colby and Oleg Kalugin. I'm not sure anyone had ever actually brought these guys together. It was interesting that a video game did. And we asked agents, it turns out, have agents, so we were able to get to them. We asked them, what are the 10 most difficult moral decisions you made in your career? And I mean, these are guys that ran the CIA and KGB, and it was very interesting. And we put, since games are user-driven narratives, we put the player in the situation of having to make those decisions and explore the consequences. It was very powerful, and we asked them what keeps them awake at night. They had very similar answers, and we built a narrative around that. A user-driven narrative around that. And I realized, I mean, this is powerful stuff. A game like Civilization, we got the rights through our legal team to do one version of Civilization. It's an iconic franchise made by one of the masterful living game designers, Sid Meier. We got the rights to do one of them. We didn't have Sid Meier's team, so we had to hire a team to build Civilization. Civilization is it's a strategy game where you essentially build civilizations by managing all the attributes that go into a healthy civilization. Since we didn't have the Sid Meier team, we had to build that team from scratch. We had to build our interpretation of history from scratch. We had to build every algorithm that goes into the game wasn't neutral. I mean, it was embedded with values. So when you would walk, and this is like 94, 95, when you would walk into our studio when games were just sort of being vilified by everybody, it was like a graduate course in history. We were debating, why isn't slavery in there? What about lawyers? Really interesting conversations on what are the attributes that affect history. And again, I realized that not just playing games, making these games is deep, deep learning, and all of that will come back later. Activision was and still is a company that's focused on maximizing shareholder value, return on capital. They're good at it. It's very successful. But by 2000, I got really interested in not just maximizing return on capital, but how do we do real impact? How do we take this powerful medium and empower kids? How do we take technology, which social media was just showing up, film, how do we look beyond just the return of capital? I helped a friend of mine, a film producer named Caroline Barron, start a nonprofit called Film Aid, which teaches film and filmmaking in refugee camps around the world, very much on the nonprofit side. If you look at this grid, the vertical axis is maximizing financial returns, horizontal is maximizing social returns. Most businesses are in the upper left. Most nonprofits are subsidized by foundations, government agencies, fundraising, bottom right. really bad businesses don't make money and do bad things. Not a lot of people aspire to be down there. But in the top right quadrant is this notion of a double bottom line or blended value business, where you're trying to make money and make impact. And that's becoming more popular because nonprofits are realizing that it's difficult to go from grant to grant. It's difficult to attract top talent. And so they're exploring, are there sustainable business models that are mission aligned? And there's a whole sector rolling up around this from the nonprofit side and the social entrepreneurship side. From the business side, there's a lot of folks that want to do more than just make money. They want to somehow align the ability to make money, because you have to make money to support your family. And but they want to align it with the values that they have or their peers and colleagues have. So there's a movement coming there. I was the CEO of it was outside the media space, it was in the technology space, of a double bottom line company called Netamat that was actually originally funded, it was an art project, it was a digital art project, a show that started with a show that was online and at the Whitney Museum in New York, and the Rockefeller Foundation funded it through an experimental double bottom line fund in 2001 called Provenex. And then we raised venture capital, strategic capital. It was a very interesting, I don't have time to go into that whole journey. The company's still out there. It just had its 10th anniversary. But it was interesting trying to manage the stakeholders of financial return and social impact. Around that time, we were actually selected as technology pioneers. I got to present at Davos at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. And I met a young woman who was a co-founder of this nonprofit called Games for Change that was seeking to rise the sector of games for social impact. And I ended up becoming chairman of Games for Change because I was so excited that when I was at Activision and I was looking to use this medium to empower people, here was a community of practice, which really didn't exist back in the early 90s and mid 90s, that really was passionate about saying, how do we harness the power of this medium? Games for Change does then and still does a convening in New York of foundations, nonprofit, government agencies, game industry folks to rise the sector. And I realized how long we had come when we got Sandra Day O'Connor to come and do a keynote. She's done a wonderful series of games called iCivics. The way she put it was when she retired from the Supreme Court and was speaking to youth around the country, she found that kids could name the 3 judges on American Idol, but not the 3 branches of government. Again, the power of popular media. And she realized she wanted to make her legacy post the bench really teaching kids why civics matters. And she realized games was the medium to do it. We got Nicholas Kristof, who some of you may know as an op-ed writer for the New York Times. He also wrote the searing book called Half the Sky. He actually announced at Games for Change a Half the Sky game that came out yesterday on Facebook. And we've done a series of mobile Half the Sky games. I'll talk about that later to empower women, girls in the developing world. We had Anish Chopra from the White House, the former CTO, the first CTO of the White House, come and speak on a number of federal game initiatives. And in fact, we realized there's almost no federal agency not exploring the power of games as perhaps a more efficient way to accomplish some of their public interest goals. There is now a federal games working group that has over 32 agencies in it. Again, we have a whole public media infrastructure for film, for television, but games are perhaps a more powerful, more broad-based medium. They actually work very well together. So where do games sit in the federal government? An interesting question, if at all. So I'll pause now. And it was while I was sort of looking at all of these impact game projects that I've been working along with a number of folks in our community of practice to kind of tease out what is it about this medium? What are the actual attributes about the medium that make it so powerful and have so much potential? And I'll quickly run through those. The biggest difference between games and linear media, books, movies, TV, is that games are participatory. You lean forward, you don't lean back. You make decisions with consequences. In SimCity, you put out the fire. You don't watch somebody else put out the fire. Players have agency. And if you look at a lot of the sort of social emotional work in schools, I mean, for a youth or a grown-up for that matter to have agency, there's actually a lot of interesting work with post-traumatic stress syndrome and games. Agency really matters. I mean, feeling like you have a control over your world, that you make a difference is a powerful thing. Games do that well. Again, a game like Civilization, talk about power. The genre is called God games because essentially you are a godlike figure when you are building a city in SimCity or a civilization in Civilization. This is a fascinating genre that doesn't really have an analog in linear media. There's actually, it's a shame, it's a concurrent panel right now with 2 teachers from here in Texas that they're middle school social studies history teachers. And over the last 6 years, they've developed a turn-based history game that really takes they've replaced their entire textbook. They go from 2000 BC to 2000 current with turn-based history games where the kids select their form of government, which is a fascinating process to watch them do that. They essentially play the role of leaders in each epoch. There's 17 turns that takes you through the full historical period, and the kids are actually historians. They are social scientists. They are finding the source data. They are making decisions. They are exploring how history unfolds based on different decisions and comparing that to how they explore what we know of history. It's very powerful. It's been very successful. The kids are unbelievably engaged. They're testing well, and other teachers are coming out of the woodwork wanting to do a similar program. So that's just an example of how a commercial game can lay the foundation for a game-infused curriculum. Another thing that games do that very unique to the interactive medium is that you can wear different identities. You can role play. You can step into other shoes and make decisions with consequences in the context of being in somebody else's shoes. So the iconic sort of social impact game that, if you guys are familiar with the space, I'm sure you've heard of, but for those that haven't, is called Peacemaker. This was a Carnegie Mellon project by a couple students there. And the idea was you would play the Israeli-Palestine conflict from both sides in a strategy game. They did a deal with Reuters. The footage in the game is searing, so you make decisions, and you see the consequences. They got experts from both sides of the conflict. And when you play that game, even if you're familiar with it, I mean, just looking at the map and dealing with the cities and immersing yourself, leaning forward, making a decision and seeing different stakeholders that you may not have thought of, it completely transforms how you look at the conflict. It was actually favorably reviewed on both sides of the conflict and is being distributed by philanthropists on both sides of the conflict to schools. Wolf Quest is an interesting one. This is an old game, but it still stands up. It's a game essentially where you play a wolf and you raise a family and you survive as a wolf. My 10-year-old last year was playing it. I'm having them, I have my kids go through these different games, and he became really immersed in this. And I walked down one day and he was just sort of sitting with his arms folded, looking at the keyboard. He wasn't actually touching the keyboard. He was just looking at it. I asked him what's going on, and his wolves were mating. And it was about a half-hour process. And I'm like, your wolves are mating? And he walked me through the whole process of how he's going to raise his cubs. And again, talk about stepping into somebody else's shoes. I mean, that's pretty unique, pretty powerful. When you see the whole gamification movement, which you probably heard of or you will hear of, it's often very much reward-focused, badges, rewards, and there's real power in those motivators. But the real power of games are when you get this delicate balance of both intrinsic rewards as well as extrinsic rewards, and you get the player on the razor's edge of what they're possible. So you accomplish something and you serve up just the right challenge and just the right context. Essentially, they're adaptive learning systems with copious feedback. I mean, games are constantly giving the players feedback at the right dose, at the right time to be able to move forward. And these long-term, short-term challenges, rewards, goals, I mean, that is great learning. And masterful game designers, make no mistake, game is a craft. People often put games in technology. Oh, it's a technology-based solution. And they often treat it as a widget. Oh, okay, we'll do a technology-based solution. We'll do a game. We'll get somebody who makes a game, and they'll build the utility. They'll do it. This is a craft like fiction. This is a craft like movies. People like Miyamoto, who does the great Nintendo games, Mario, Will Wright, who did SimCity, Sid Meier, these are masterful artisans. And they're precious, they are as precious as a Spielberg or a Coppola or whatever great author you think of. Another thing that games do that is very unique and is not done well in our society in general, and it's certainly not done well in a lot of schools, is embracing failure, not only to learn from failure, but actually to make failure fun and evocative. Good game designers understand that most of what you do in a game is fail. Really good game designers understand that that failure helps scaffold you to get to the next step. Brilliant game designers make failure evocative, fun, and memorable. There was a BBC game a few years back called Climate Change. They actually updated it with a game called Fate of the World. And they did an interesting study. In the game, it's a very much a strategy game. And they got a lot of, it's based on real data, real science. And they enable you in the game to essentially melt down the planet. It's a failure state. And they found that the players that were transgressive, that did the failure state, and players are often transgressive, actually learn more than the ones that played it without the failure state, which was interesting. And then, Will Wright, who's, one of the greatest living designers, there's a failure state when the sim is trying to do some exercise when you're a character. But again, very memorable, very evocative. Most social service organizations really, the holy grail is behavior change. Not just knowledge, not just awareness, but really creating behavior change. Behavior change is really hard. But games are increasingly going from products to services. So when I was at Activision, we would make a game, we would put it in a box, we would push it through Walmart or Best Buy or Target. Now, that still exists for the big tentpole releases, Call of Duty, Madden. But increasingly, games are becoming services. So Facebook games like Farmville and whatnot, World of Warcraft, virtual worlds, these are services. They don't go away. They're continually optimized. The power of that is game designers are sitting next to data heuristic experts, sitting next to product and project managers, and they're constantly optimizing to get more users and get more money. But there's no reason why they couldn't optimize for civic engagement or learning outcomes. Essentially, it's what you hear a lot at this conference. It's adaptive system. And so things like all of the health things like Nike Fuel, these things are really working. If you embrace them and you buy into it, you are constantly getting data back on your health outcomes in the real world. And if you get the right challenges, rewards, engagement loops, it's very powerful. We're actually working on a project with USAID and the organization called NetHope to take the city building genre on Facebook. Games like Cityville, Farmville, Frontierville, these are nurturing games. You're nurturing a city, you're nurturing a farm, you're nurturing a community. The way companies that make those games like Zynga, that's having some struggles right now, the way they make money is to advance in the game, to unlock a mission, to get a vanity item, to make your city look cooler. You have to do these microtransactions. You have to pay a little bit of money. You might pay money to save time. You don't have to get up at 8 in the morning and farm and water your plants. You might buy an item. And this is a multi-billion-dollar economy. Instead of asking players to pay money to advance in the game, we have them do online and real-world civic engagement with vetted NGOs, nonprofits that are doing youth empowerment. Same model, and we still, we're hiring the game makers who made these very engaging games. So again, it's the idea of games as a service and behavior change. Stephen Hawking talks about the 21st century as being the century of complexity, and it is. And navigating complexity and complex challenges, whether they're health challenges, pandemic challenges, climate challenges, is going to be essential to our survival. Games are about complexity. The card on I guess it's your right, is a Pokemon card. Most people my age struggle to make heads or tails of that. 5-year-olds who've embraced that fiction and that world and that environment could parse it out in a second. That's navigating complexity. SimCity, another very complex game. You look at that and it's like, wow, that's hard to learn. But those that embrace that engagement experience have no problem navigating the complexity. Collaboration. A game like World of Warcraft is a guild-based game. It's a team-based game. You have folks that have never met each other, often kids, somehow getting 8, 9, 10 people to show up, all with egos, all with different skills, to accomplish missions together. Well, that's management. And it's not in theory. Lots of companies like IBM have studied World of Warcraft, published around World of Warcraft, on how managing and running a guild is essentially management training. And then you have things like Connect and Wii that are bringing folks together in the same physical space. We do a lot of work with Sesame Workshop, and to me, in terms of things like early literacy, over and over again, the most powerful research are if you have an attached, caring parent or an attached, caring adult that's going to regularly have dialogue with you as a kid, that's the most important thing. I mean, it's not, when you read a book, it's less the reading of the book than the conversation around the book, the dialogue around the book, the situated language that emerges. When you don't have that, it's almost impossible to recover that. Again, games can perhaps step in there, intergenerational games that are specifically designed to foster certain language, certain dialogue, and anything that fosters more intergenerational dialogue is almost always good. And then they have this concept of islands of expertise. If kids are passionate about dinosaurs or trains, if you can really stoke that passion for that island of expertise, and again, get caring adults to engage with you around it, very powerful results. Games can do that in a collaborative way. One of the most interesting new trends in games is this idea of collective intelligence and big data. So a game, how many of you have heard of Fold It or read about Fold It? Okay, so a lot of you haven't. This is, it's worth Googling. This is a DARPA-funded project that came out of the University of Washington. And essentially, it's a game where they crowdsourced the folding of proteins, because it turns out the computer is not very good at certain research around folding proteins. The human eye and the human brain is better. And there's quite a few things that the human eye and the human brain is better for. So they had 30, 40,000 kids and some adults folding proteins, and they actually have had a couple major breakthrough, one in the AIDS space. And this has been heavily publicized in the press. It's been covered in major medical journals. It wasn't really designed as a learning game. They're doing that now to sort of scaffold you a little bit on a little bit more about what protein folding is all about from a learning perspective. It was really to solve a thorny medical challenge. Galaxy Zoo does it in a similar way with space. You look at patterns in space, because apparently the human eye can pick up certain patterns, which can help astronomers better than a computer. Very interesting field. Our company is really passionate about the idea of youth creation. When kids, I mean, right, kids today, there's a seamless line. We actually did a panel yesterday on this idea of the create and share generation. They don't just consume content, they mod content, they remix content, they create content. So we have a middle school, I'll talk about it a little bit later, platform that teaches kids youth game design that we did in partnership with MacArthur Foundation Institute of Play. It's a middle school curriculum. Minecraft, for anybody who has a child between the age of 8 and 14, I'm sure you're familiar with Minecraft. It's probably the most successful independent game in history. And it is a creation game. It is essentially a digital version of Legos on steroids in a connected community, unlike anything I've ever seen as a phenomenon. And teachers are crying out in sort of a bottom-up way to figure out how do we get Minecraft in the classroom. So there's a company called Teacher Gaming. There's the Minecraft teacher who is trying to reduce the friction to enable Minecraft to come into the classroom to scaffold all sorts of lessons. One thing never to forget is the notion of play, the notion of wonder. I have a whole story about a deer and the bobsled track at Salt Lake City, but I don't think I have time to go into it. Maybe at the end, if I do, I'll tell you the story. But play is really intrinsic to humans and animals. And it's very easy to become ponderous when trying to turn games into learning, health, social impact. You can't lose that notion of joy and play, and you know when you have it. Ultimately, with close to a third of kids not graduating on time or dropping out, I mean, we have a serious problem with engagement and relevancy. And you know, the Gates did a really powerful study that was a big influence in our forming the company, where they interviewed thousands of kids who dropped out. And there's no one silver bullet. A lot of stresses in a lot of kids' life, but the one thing that was consistent was a lack of relevancy. That just they didn't feel like what was happening in school was relevant. And when there's whatever the stress is, a financial stress, whatever the stress is, if it's not relevant, you know, if it doesn't seem like it's going to make a difference, then you're not going to stick it out. So again, games aren't a silver bullet, and you know, there's good games and bad games, but games and game theory can really make a difference in terms of engagement and relevancy if well done. So that's the good news. They asked me to talk about the challenges as well as the potential in this presentation. So that's why it's called Mind the Gap. As chairman of Games for Change, I got to look at literally hundreds of philanthropic, public interest funded games. So government agencies, foundations, nonprofits, universities. And a lot of really interesting research, a lot of really interesting insights. But we found an enormous gap between the research, which was often in a small developer or in a university lab, and actual products and services that were addressing these huge challenges. And so we originally were going to do a venture fund to invest, but we found that these were projects, not companies. And so we switched from a venture to a publishing thesis to build repeatable, scalable mechanisms through multi-stakeholder partnerships to help scale the best research into products and services that could make impact, mostly in the game space. We do some stuff in the comic space. So that's how we founded Eline as a double bottom line company, equally committed to making meaningful, measurable impact and risk-adjusted market-based returns. We've been developing a methodology, and every day we're developing a methodology. This slide is already out of date, but it hits the top of the waves in terms of how we think of things. And probably the most important thing is that when we start a project, we look at the full life cycle. We don't jump in and say, what would be a cool design or whatnot. We really think about what is the impact we want? What is the audience, for whom do we want to make this impact? What is the context? Because all of these things have an enormous impact on the design and the ultimate scalability and sustainability of it. So I'm going to tease out some of the top ones. Very briefly, I'll talk about some of the stuff we're doing, but if you're interested afterwards, I can talk about the actual products we're doing and the products we're doing with the Center for Games and Impact at Arizona State University, which is a new center designed to study the full life cycle of games for impact. Research, design, development, marketing, distribution, scale, optimization. We have 3 lines of business. Our Pathways line is a real passion of ours where it's an interest-driven line where we look to tap into kids' natural interests. So we're pushing a rock downhill, not uphill. Build a gateway product in late elementary school, middle school, and a pathway around that interest all the way to college. We've picked 4 pathways: youth game design, youth entrepreneurship, youth fab, youth making things. There's a great makerspace here. And youth social entrepreneurship, being a change maker. Because of some success we've had with our first interest-driven product, Gamestar Mechanic in the youth game design space, which is very, quickly scaled to more than 4,000 schools using the curriculum, totally bottoms up, no top-down sales and marketing. I'll talk about that a little bit later. We've started a foundations line of business in partnership with Arizona State University and the Center for Games and Impact, where we actually are looking at game-infused curriculum that are not supplemental games. There are a lot of supplemental games out there that are not fun enough to be in the consumer space, and yet they don't take enough of the learning trajectory. They're not replacing time or money in the classroom, so they're in this nether, this valley of insufficiency, I call it. Even if it's a good design, even if it's an interesting thing, it's just too hard for the teacher to adopt. Often millions of dollars go into it, so it's not right-sized in terms of the investment. So we're looking at game-infused curriculum that can actually replace a meaningful chunk of the classroom experience, both for better learning, but also for a business model. Historia would be a great example of that. And recently we launched Gateways, which is consumer games that are kind of analogous to documentaries or art films or films that really inspire the imagination, often the films that win the Academy Awards, Argo. Games that really serve as gateways to new ideas, challenging themes. Almost every business has been completely transformed by the internet. The game business is no exception. So with Activision, again, we controlled the channel of where boxes went. With the internet, you can now go directly to the consumer on the web. You can go to them on Facebook. You can go to them through Steam, through the online channels like Xbox Live Arcade. I mean, so you can disintermediate the sort of bottleneck supply channels. So there's a vibrant, independent game community that's emerging, that's exploring really interesting themes. So we've opened a line of business. We didn't want to do that until we had world-class talent because, again, this is a craft. You can't just say, oh, let's do consumer games, especially if you're doing them on the kind of higher end and you really want to compete in the tween and teen space, which is very, very competitive. But we now have a great team. Interestingly, we did a partnership with an Alaska Native tribe, very forward-thinking. They want to build the first indigenous-owned game company. We're going to partner with them on that. And that has attracted some of the best people I worked with at Activision and at some of the other big publishers who really want to take this medium to the next level. We'll be talking more about this at Games for Change. We'll be showing some of the projects we're doing there. So I'm going to go through some of the key things that we've learned and are continuing to learn really matter when you do games for impact. And this is kind of the meaty side of the presentation. So the first thing that we've learned is that everything we do has a number of stakeholders, and if we don't align the stakeholders, the project is going to be a nightmare. We have philanthropic funders, we sometimes have commercial funders, we have domain experts, we have game makers, we have users. So how do we identify who the stakeholders are that matter? How do we identify the interests of the stakeholders, and how do we align those interests? Interestingly, my oldest brother, some of you may know, my middle brother helped start the Fab Labs, is at MIT. A lot of people know him, but my oldest brother, actually, this is his specialty. And I kept calling him and getting advice, and he now has developed a really interesting tool that you can see the visualization where he has folks in a multi-stakeholder partnership in lateral systems where nobody's necessarily in charge. I identify the stakeholders, identify their interests, and then they do blind surveys, and he has visual tools to identify whether the stakeholders are aligned. It's amazing. When you go through this process, you go like, wow, we really are misaligned. We really aren't communicating. Again, it's a diagnostic tool. There's more and more tools like this that are very powerful. You need the right skills. This is actually our team working on the Alaska project. It's we have the head, we have the creative director, the game designer, the programmer, the lead artist, the head of production, but we also have the Alaska native domain experts. There's a whole mixture of sort of core people that are at the center of this team. You know, there can't be a weak link in the stool. You need to understand the core skills you need, and you need to make sure that there are qualified folks filling each of those. And if you don't have somebody who can even articulate what those key skills are, you need to find somebody who can help you manage the project to do that. This is probably the hardest part of any project, is really getting the stakeholders to be able to articulate what are you trying to do in terms of outputs, outcomes, and how are you going to assess it. In the social impact sector, there's some really good, if you're interested in kind of social impact in general, McKinsey has done a lot of really good work where they pulled together a lot of the top foundations, a lot of the thought leaders, and really dug down deep in terms of methodologies for assessing impact. What's interesting is because we do stuff primarily in learning, but we also do some health and some broader social impact. There's different lexicons. Like the social impact sector talks about inputs, outputs, outcomes. They're actually moving away from that a little bit, but it's still a very useful term. They talk about costs per beneficiary in the developing world. You know, learning has the evolving Common Core standards. There's the CASEL social emotional learner standards. There aren't great standards around motivation and engagement. There should be. It's actually in some ways the easiest thing to track, but it's not really. And then you have sort of the quote-unquote gold standard of randomized controlled trials, which are often very expensive, very cumbersome, and they're often, I mean, they definitely have a place, and they're very useful, but these environments are constantly changing. So by the time you get through a randomized control trial, everything may have changed. So, I mean, again, there's a lot of work in the research space with use-inspired research, design-inspired research. We're exploring something called impact-based research that's a little bit more fluid, where the stakeholders trying to really figure out what you want to do. And sometimes it's helpful to talk about outputs versus outcomes. So like classic examples of where there would be a misalignment between an output and an outcome. Studies where folks donated a lot of clothes to, say, a village in South America. And an output would be, okay, how many people donated how many pieces of clothes? How many clothes were distributed? Wow, that's awesome. Look at that. We had 10,000 articles of clothing distributed to this village. But an outcome is it killed the local business for clothes. It created a demand for Western clothes. I mean, there's been lots of studies over the years in the social impact space of where outputs don't necessarily align to outcomes. Here's a question. Does Common Core standards as outputs or standardized testing result in outcomes of students becoming lifelong learners, having the ability and confidence and courage to realize their potential? Maybe, maybe not, but these are things that are important to assess. The key is at a project and at a community of practice level, not to get too hung up on the nomenclature, but to really articulate what you're trying to do in as plain English as possible, make sure folks are aligned, and then figure out what evidence you can get along the way to know you're on the right track and continually optimize the system. Again, easier said than done, but fundamentally that's what we believe is the right methodology. This is something that's often overlooked and often spread too thin. Oh, it's a game, so all kids will like it. Well, I mean, obviously you have to break down demographic in terms of cognitively, what say a 4-year-old versus an 8-year-old can do, or a 4-year-old or a 14-year-old for that matter. And there's some gender differences. Obviously, literacy is a big one, geography, social economic status. Every grant I've ever seen from every agency says we have to reach underserved youth or underserved populations. And yet, I've been a reviewer. In fact, I'm a reviewer tomorrow and Friday for a bunch of NSF grants. big stated goal, underserved populations. And again, 90% of the stuff is high-end tablets. It's just there is a misalignment. I mean, if you're serious about really reaching underserved youth, you have to understand, like, people talk about the pass-back effect, which is very real, where a parent will pass back an iPhone or a tablet from the front seat to the back seat. Well, often in poorer communities, the mobile device is too precious. It doesn't get passed back. I mean, you have to really go into the communities where you want to work, understand what devices are being used, understand, and different communities are totally different. It's hard work if you really want to do it. Then there's the psychographic, which is, you know, what are folks interested in? Things like World of Warcraft is not a demographic-based game. I mean, there's a very diverse user base in that game. In terms of age, in terms of region. It's a little gender biased to male, not 100%. So psychographic are things like gaming literacy, interests. These are things that marketers understand very, very well, but social impact and learning folks are not as sophisticated on. The context of the experience is huge. I mean, making a game or a game-based curriculum for a traditional classroom versus one of these flipped, blended classrooms versus something that's totally not moderated and consumer-driven is a completely different design exercise. So again, I can't tell you how many proposals we see where, oh, it's a game, it'll be consumer, it'll be in school, it'll be after school. Extremely difficult to do. I mean, our youth game design platform is seeking to cross all of those, but we're increasingly teasing out the significant differences to have that franchise successfully live in each of those channels. So really understand the context of the experience. In general, when we go into the classroom, it's less about the kids. I mean, the kids, in general, it's going to be more fun than a lecture or a textbook. It's really about reducing friction for the teacher, showing learning efficacy, which obviously the kids need to respond to. But if you're trying to do something in the consumer space, you know, totally different if you're trying to sell to the parent or the kids. Very different value proposition, very different rhythm, very different priorities. For as long as I've been in the game business, I've been in a fragmented platform world. So in the early 90s, we had Sega, we had Nintendo, Microsoft came along, kind of replaced Nintendo. Sony came along as a player. The PC has always been there, but it's been fragmented, PC, Mac. We're always going to be in a fragmented space, fortunately, because there's competition. So right now, in the classroom, you have interactive whiteboards, which are largely not effectively used as it relates to game-based learning. Could be, and we're looking at some stuff there. You have tablets. You have a sort of fragmented iOS, Android space right now, likely to be fragmented for a while. Amplify had their big announcement now. We're going to see a lot of those coming down the pike of generic tablets as well as sort of OEM bundled tablets. Bring your own device. We live in New Jersey, but we're spending a year and a half out in Arizona, going to public schools, both places. All of my kids in both cities have had me sign a form saying that they can bring their own device to class. It's just happening. It's almost impossible to stop. But how you leverage the fact that you have potentially 30 different devices in the classroom, boy, that's complex. You know, folks that can help figure out how to navigate that, and they're doing it. Things like polls, there are widgets that will work across any device, and they're gonna be very effective. So, you know, and again, if you make them more engaging through some of the game theory, that's even better. Connectivity is always gonna be an issue, so stress that. One of the big things that we're doing at Arizona State University is teasing out the difference between what we call a small G game and a big G game. A small G game is a game that you play and finish. And it's what you would typically think about as a game, an adventure game, a simulation game, a strategy game. They do different things well. The big G game, my colleague James Paul G, and if you're interested in game-based learning, read Jim G's stuff. It's some of the best stuff in the field. I mean, he introduced at Games for Change last year this notion of a big G game, which is really the stuff that happens around the game, the affinity spaces, which are huge in things like Minecraft, mentorship, peer mentorship, professional mentorship, intergenerational mentorship, identity, your identity traveling from in the game to outside the game, the challenges and rewards, smart tools, tools that you learn to use in the game, tools you can use outside the game. And we believe that the real power of games are games as a service that effectively do small G and big G for what they do well, and that the games don't try to do things that they don't do well. And there's many things games don't do well. So here's a really interesting example of one of the Half the Sky mobile games we did. There's a game called 9 Minutes. We worked with SEDPA, the UN Maternal Health Agency, take 9 months of a pregnancy, collapse it down to 9 minutes. It's a fun game. It's a Twitch-oriented game. And there's some learning in there. You kind of learn what you do each month, especially in the developing world. I mean, it's not just there's some stuff around nutrition, around exercise, but as you get to month 8, you got to start preparing your bags because traffic is insane. Many people don't make it to the hospital in time. So there's some good learning there. The game can situate some very powerful concepts, but that's not where the real impact of this game comes. The real impact comes from we've identified these amazing text-to-baby services so that if a nursing mother, if a woman is pregnant and they sign up for one of these text services where every week they're getting a text saying when they need to go to the doctor, what they need to do, they're just proven outcomes, very strong health outcomes. So if our game can situate a mother to think about these things and then connect them to the big G text messaging service that lives outside it, we're going to save lives. I mean, we can actually measure the lives that we're going to save. That's an example of just finely tuning where the game fits in the ecosystem. And then we're actually going to use FilmAid to do these mass screenings of 10, 30,000 people that we do in these refugee camps that are astounding when you see them. We can put up a text message on the movie screen, especially if there's a maternal theme in the movie that we're showing. They can then download the app, play the app, and then connect to a text messaging service. That's sort of playing out with a full life cycle. With Gamestar Mechanic, our game-infused curriculum that we do for middle school kids that's designed to foster systems thinking, 21st century skills, motivation for STEM, this is not just a game. There's an entire game that you play through, a small G game, where you go through an adventure game, you solve problems, you meet characters, you have to play games that you're going to make, you have to fix broken games to isolate design principles, you learn the core principles of what makes a good game, and gradually you're unlocking the tools in a toolbox to make your own games. And then you can actually publish your games into a community that we run of hundreds of thousands of kids where you learn to be a digital citizen, you can review games, you can comment on games. And I mean, it's amazing when a kid uploads a game and it's played by somebody else. I mean, it's a remarkable experience for them. We've had over 350,000 games uploaded, played 10 million times in 100 countries, and we're just starting to get going. But that's a combination of small G and big G. A lot of people said, like, when we took over Gamestar Mechanic, the original developer had gone out of business, so we picked this project up midstream. We were originally going to take it out in the consumer channel because we've done a lot in the consumer channel, and at that point we hadn't done anything in the ed channel. And everybody said, oh, you're not going to get a middle school game design curriculum to teach game making? No one's going to buy that. And that essentially this block is what people said was the school channel. You just can't penetrate it. Don't even try. But teachers kept telling us not to let this project die. And we knew there was a demand out there, and we knew just with our own kids that we wanted to motivate them. We knew that things like systems thinking, the higher order 21st century skills, problem solving, critical thinking, digital media literacy, we knew that this stuff mattered. We also, when we looked really closely, we saw that the block had a lot of cracks. First of all, the internet, like it disintermediated the game business, it's disintermediating education distribution just a little bit slower. So, you know, things like Edmodo, BrainPop, I mean, these are remarkable in that they have huge communities of teachers, really engaged teachers that are online in a digital space. So we sought out these partners, A, to learn from them, but also to do partnerships. So again, with no sales or marketing, just we focus on teacher discoverability, reducing friction for teacher adoption, which is everything from efficacy to making it simple to use, and teacher-to-teacher recommendation. You know, we're in thousands and thousands and thousands of schools. It's growing quickly, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students, and we're just beginning the process. So, you know, whether you're going in through new innovation schools, whether you're going in through folks that have teacher communities like Edmodo or BrainPop, whether you're going into new elective spaces, after-school spaces, there's a lot. If you finely tune a product and it is effective, I believe there's no problem getting it into schools. And now we're studying very carefully, you know, what budgets are we tapping into? What is the right amount to charge? We actually just changed the business model on this because a lot of folks were telling us that when kids use a creation environment in school, like the Adobe products and other products, you know, it's really powerful, but then they leave the class, they can't afford a lot of these products, even the wealthier kids. These are expensive creation tools, and so it falls off a cliff. It kind of, you lose the whole concept of a pathway and the motivation and the trajectory. So we actually changed our model to $2. We have a free version where any school can sign up, and there's a fairly robust free version. But as you go to the premium version, our model is $2 per student for a lifetime membership. So it's very cheap. A teacher can almost pay for it out of just a classroom budget, and the kids have it for life. And we, we're tuning it so that it still makes sense for us financially. But again, that's sort of a double bottom line thought process. So this is an example of kind of where we are with Gamestar Mechanic. As an example, Brian from Eline is here. If anyone's interested in youth game design, you can talk to Brian afterwards, and he can tell you more about that. So to come back to the very beginning, and then I'll open it up for questions. I started with this notion of this XY grid of making money and making impact. Certainly there's always going to be a balance between financial return and financial impact. One thing that we've discovered, when you look at this grid, we originally thought that we want to be on the top right, in the top right corner. We kind of don't think that that's realistic anymore. We think that you can maximize for financial returns and still filter for an alignment with social impact. And it kind of puts you on, I guess it's your right. And that you want to keep working both. You want to keep going up in terms of financial return. You want to keep going over in terms of social impact. But you kind of have to understand where the center of gravity is. And certain products we do, the center of gravity is around maximizing financial returns, but with a rigorous filter for the social impact goals that the stakeholders have aligned around. Projects like Half the Sky in the developing world, again, we're never going to ask the end user for money for that. It's a third-party philanthropically funded, but we do want it to be sustainable. And kind of the way we look at the work that we do in the hardcore social impact space is, if somebody could pay for it, would they pay for it? It's a good litmus test of, is there value here? Are we really making a difference in their life? And then if the answer is yes, there's almost always there's a third-party funder. And again, it might be a local business that wants to sponsor it. It might be a local foundation. But understanding that there has to be value there has to be a sustainability model, because the real impact is going to be if you have a team that wakes up every morning, goes to bed every night saying, how am I going to optimize this service to meet its impact goals, to meet its scale, and to meet its reach? So I'm going to stop there. It's kind of a top of the waves. I want to leave 10 minutes for questions. So there's the sort of journey from commercial film, commercial games, to double bottom line games for learning, health, and social impact. So I'll pause there and ask if there's any questions.
You mentioned the other author who talked about the big G, small g.
Mm-hmm.
Could you refresh his name again?
James Paul Gee, G-E-E. He's at Arizona State University. And interesting, his field is literacy. And he's a world-renowned literacy scholar. And when his kids were growing up and he watched them playing games, he realized that this is a powerful form of literacy. He immersed himself in the games. He's actually one of the most sophisticated gamers I've ever met. And he wrote the seminal books on games and learning. He actually founded the Games, Learning, and Society Conference in Wisconsin, which is one of the best conferences on games and learning. And he's sort of birthed a whole generation of folks, including Constance Steinklor, who has actually just finished a tour at the White House in the Office of Science Technology Policy, specifically focused on games in the public interest. So James Paul Gee. And then there's another learning scientist named Sasha Barab, who's actually in a concurrent panel right now, who's here at the show. And if you're interested, and he's well known for the Quest Atlantis virtual world platform, which is a project that we are working on with the Gates Foundation.
Hi. We're a one-to-one campus, and one of the things that I hear a lot from parents and teachers is concern about screen time. Can you talk about that a little bit when it comes to gaming?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the years that I've been speaking to parents and teachers, it's actually shifted from the issue of violence, which is obviously now back in the press in a big way, to the issue of screen time as the #1 concern. And as a parent of tweens, I have deep concerns about screen time. It's a really interesting question, because it's not just games. I mean, there's just an endless amount of digital media. The phone, when a kid gets a phone, I mean, it's such a personal item. I mean, it's connected. I mean, we know it. I mean, look how we use our phones. You're connected to your friends. You're connected to the world. There's an endless supply of fun things you could do. And that's a challenge. So I do think it's an issue. I think it's something that there's no silver bullet for. I think teaching self-regulation for kids and adults, because adults are often a terrible role model when it comes to this, is absolutely critical. I think schools can do a much better job. I think parents can do a much better job of really understanding best practices to know when a kid is in a flow state and or is just deeply connected with friends. Like I'm on a temporary move to Arizona. The fact that my kids are staying in touch with their friends and relatives in New Jersey is phenomenal while they're away. I mean, that's an incredible use of the device. Kids are doing amazing things on the device. My son's a budding photographer, and he's finding amazing tools around photography. So you kind of got to know what they're doing when they're in a productive state and when they're just zoning out and they need to be outside or they need to be doing their homework. So informed parents, engaged dialogue is critical. From a game design perspective, some of the things that we're looking at, I think because games can become deeply immersive, and in the neuroscience debate and the medical debate, there's a question as to when immersive becomes addictive, and it's really when it becomes destructive to your life. And that does exist, and you get a lot of high-profile stuff in Korea and China right now because some very tragic high-profile addiction issues on games. But I believe game designers can be more effective about designing games to have shorter play experiences that reward you for taking a break. I mean, World of Warcraft did things like, if you took a break, you got benefits when you came back to the game. Games like Farmville purposely slow you up because they want you to come back every day. So you can do it. So, I mean, to me, it's a great question. I think the industry has to deal with it. I actually think it's commercially smart to deal with it.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a former teacher, and my students love the math games that they were able to play. However, I found that the contextual transfer of knowledge didn't always happen. They could do it on the computer screen, but once they were brought into their seats with a paper and pencil, it was very difficult. Are there certain games that enable that contextual transfer of information? Is that something that's being assessed and evaluated as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll use an analog in the brain game space, and then I'll come back and answer the question specifically. We're working with a really interesting neuroscientist that studied what happens when you play games in the brain. Her name is Daphne Bevelet. She's currently in Geneva. And she studied a lot of the sort of brain training games will train you on a task. So you'll do it over and over and over again. Your brain is plastic. It's more plastic when you're younger. It changes when you get older. Your brain actually gets rewired to do that task better. Like Tetris, was actually a neuroscience project, and you can do two things in Tetris. You have to find the right spot and you have to put it in the right angle. But there hasn't been transfer. So that you can do that task, and if that task is valuable, then the brain science game has been good, but it hasn't transferred to other tasks. And so we're working on a project. This is very provocative. She's found games like Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, the most violent first-person shooters, actually rewire the brain for tasks that have transfer because you're doing real-time statistical inference under pressure, and that's rewiring the brain for a number of benefits. And so that's a very provocative example of transfer. So some games do transfer better than others. The reason why I stress games as a service, if I'm doing a math game and I'm finding that it's engaging but not transfer, well, let's figure out how to get transfer. I mean, again, it's a solvable problem, but there's probably, if we're getting enough evidence that there's not transfer, we got to refactor the game. So there are ones that are going to that level of research, but that's a great example of, okay, let's have the stakeholders get together and say, how are we assessing whether there's transfer? Are we getting evidence that we're in the right direction? How are we optimizing that?
I teach philosophy at a public liberal arts college. And first I want to say, absolutely, James Paul G., read him, everybody. Really worthwhile. But I also wanted to say thank you for all of this sort of information that you've provided in your presentation about what are the actual steps involved in doing this sort of thing right. I'm in my second year of trying to design a game course in philosophy. And doing it on my own, sort of as a faculty member at a college, is hard. And not having the sort of background that's necessary to make things scale, and that's, so thank you for the presentation.
Sure. Well, thank you for and we don't get anywhere near enough philosophers in our sector. I mean, I would go to Games for Change this year. I would go to GLS. If convince your school it's worth it. I mean, what you're doing is really, really hard, and it's important that you're part of a community of practice. And there really are, I mean, you will find other philosophy teachers, you will find other teachers that are trying to do similar things. It's great to have colleagues and cohorts when you do something as hard as what you're trying to do, so great. Yeah, I think we have time for just one more.
Hi, I have a question about gender issues in gaming, that from a very young age, the percentage of girls, although it's really growing, is lower than boys who are gaming. And we even see it at the Center for New Media Teaching and Learning at Columbia University. The games that they've developed specifically for Barnard College, for girls in the sciences, they've had to modify games to appeal to the girls, to integrate them into pedagogy. So it's about girls and gaming.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people studying that with, I would say, conflicting data that comes back. I mean, there's no question there's differences. We see it across every genre, and there's no question there's similarities. And I would say as a community, over the years from the early 1990s, I've probably seen as many as 15 girl game companies open and close. And I think they tried to zero in on not strong, either they didn't execute well, which is, it's a hard business, so it's possible that, but a lot of them I think zeroed in on data that just wasn't quite there. And I mean, we were looking at it with Gamestar, and I don't even know if this was accurate. I mean, some early observations, but I think it's changed, was that when girls and boys make games, I mean, I've certainly observed boys will pack as many enemies in the game as possible as soon as they get there and make it as kinetic and crazy. And girls often will create a landscape, will create a world. But when they go through the program, at the very end of the program, it's hard to tell the difference because they've learned the principles of game design, they're doing balance, and they're each expressing themselves in different ways. So I think there's real deep differences as to how they approach it, but then that starts to change as they go through the process of the course. Now that's one type of game with one type of data. It's a good question. There's definite more research that needs to be done, and a lot of people are focused on it. Again, I'm not an expert in that area. We follow the research. I haven't seen research that's fundamentally changed the way that we're designing the games. Interestingly, the Alaska Native game we're doing has a young girl protagonist, and we were just up in Barrow, Alaska, minus 30 degrees, working with the Inupiat communities, and there was a lot of debate as to whether it should be a young girl or a young boy in terms of how their community would look at that. And then I mean, it's something we take seriously, but I can't point you to research that says this is the research that we follow. In other areas, I can. So thank you very much for coming out in the morning.